All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's conversation about this important and powerful new book, Engineered Conflict: Structural Violence and the Future of Black Life in Chicago. I am so excited to be in conversation tonight with the author, David Omotoso Stovall, and with Professor Alex Vitale. My name is Brian Jones. I'm Senior Director of Reading and Engagement here at the New York Public Library. Before I begin, we'd like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this possible, and want to just remind you that if you don't already have a library card, it's really, really easy to get one. Just stop by the information desk, actually any information desk in the building. I was going to say the one on the first floor, but any of them. And finally, make sure that you check out the New York Public Library's website, nypl.org, to find out about more programs like this, including more programs in this series. This is the 7 Stories Up program series. We have an excellent lineup of other talks ahead, including artists and author talks, classical voice and instrumental ensembles, poetry, conversations about important social issues, and more. And we'd love to see you here again soon. So let me say something about tonight's speakers. Alex S. Vitale is professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults for community-based movements, human and civil rights organizations, and governments internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of 2 books, City of Disorder: How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and his second, The End of Policing. In addition to his scholarly writings, he's also a frequent essayist with bylines in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, and many more, and has appeared as a commentator on many different TV shows, including CNN, MSNBC, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. And the author of this book tonight is here with us. Dave Stovall is professor in the Departments of Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His scholarship investigates critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and the intersection of race, place, and school. In addition to bringing theory to action, he works with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. He has contributed to more than a dozen books and is the author of Born Out of Struggle: Critical Race Theory, School Creation, and the Politics of Interruption. And of course, he's the author of the focus of today's conversation, his newest book, Engineered Conflict: Structural Violence and the Future of Black Life in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Alex and David. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for this book. This was such a powerful and hard-hitting, you pulled no punches in this book. And I was, by the time I got to the end of it, I think I understood more deeply you, how you grew up. This is a deeply personal book. It's a deeply Chicago book. So I want to get to how it relates to other places in New York. But I noted, when I was going back through my notes, I remembered that you said at the beginning that this was a 25-year journey, this book. So can you just talk to us about your journey to writing this book?
Again, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. And man, Brian, thank you so much for having me. I think before I start any conversation, I just want to say justice to our families in Palestine, justice to our families in the Congo, justice to our families in Sudan, justice to our families in Haiti, justice to our families in Jamaica, justice to our families in Venezuela. And please remember the Twin Cities in this moment. So I think one of the things in terms of that 25-year journey is really just paying attention to the day-to-day, right? So you're in a world and you see how the world moves, right? You start to pay attention to these little things that may appear innocuous, but it's in your conversations. Like one of the things is it will sound extremely mundane, but then I started to put it together. So the Chicago Police Department used to do this thing where they had license plates on their cars. So now you see the MP on everybody's car, the municipal police. But in Chicago, they didn't have to do that. So you would have to figure out who. So now you just weren't looking for a Crown Victoria, but you were actually looking for a double letter on the license plate, right? So you would see that and, oh, we know who that is, right? Or they actually, at one time, the Chicago Police Department had these, what they called a tactical uniform that did not refract light. So they could walk right up on you without you seeing them if it was at night. And then there was another program called Hang Up on the Bad Guys. And this is back then, I'm dating myself, y'all. So this is the days of
payphones,
right? Payphones and pagers, right? So, and I remember coming to New York, I was like, man, New York still got payphones. Like that was just a thing. But they would cut off payphones at 10 o'clock at night. And that was supposedly to prevent folks from engaging in transactions. So you just kind of put together your life, and then you start to ask these questions when people start to talk about violence, right? So we're no longer, so that it got me away from ever thinking about an inherently violent young person, but now saying, are there systems that can create an instance where violence is more likely to occur, right? So that was that kind of 25-year trajectory of just putting these things together and then trying to write about something in that way.
And so that's where we get the title, Engineered Conflict. So if you've heard of, and as you probably have, if you've heard anything on the news about Chicago, it's a site of conflict, it's a site of violence. And here I'm reading the thesis of this book is that actually all that conflict that you've heard about is engineered.
Mm-hmm. So I actually got a way to think about that and saying, well, look, if I come from education, so I always would tell my students, all right, look, if I split the classroom in two, you all are one school, you are another school, I close you all and then send everybody to that school that remains open, what happens on the first day, right? So for me, it was just like, well, damn, that's just a way to just incite all types of conflict and violence, right? But to do that 50 times in one summer now begs a different question, right? So as a critical race theorist, it's always asking that question. We're not talking about a individualized act of racism. We need to be talking about a structural racism, right? So now as we need to be talking about a structural racism, we also need to be talking about a structural violence, right? So this idea of I can make you fight each other, right? Unbeknownst to you, right? So this thing around, but again, asking that question, to what end and for what purpose, right? And that really kind of begs that question around, I will engage in a process to make you fight each other because I have considered both of you disposable. So this thing around really using that mechanism to rethink how we understand those conflicts that we see, right? So to get us past internet beefs, to get us past any things about relationships that may have transpired between folks, where those are real, but there's a concentration of them that we are not engaging, right? And I think that's where that engineering comes from. And a dear friend of mine named Catherine Cho, who went to undergrad for engineering, when I presented this years ago, she said, well, as an engineer, we're trained around the elimination of human error. So that's what we're trained to do. So now my question became, all right, well, who accounts for the error, right? And how does that play itself out in a city? And what does a city do to cleanse itself of that which has been deemed the error, right? So that kind of asking that question in real time, knowing that we're not just talking about inherently violent young people.
Dave, as a sociologist, I was immediately drawn to the Venn diagram you have early in the book of overlapping circles that talk about the main themes of the book around housing, education, and policing, and the ways in which school closures, housing disinvestment, and intensive policing come together to produce this engineered conflict that you've talked about. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about why you think those three arenas of lived experience are so important for understanding what's going on in the Black community in Chicago, and how your own personal experience growing up in Chicago was shaped by these three primary institutions.
So kind of tagging Brian's question in there, that's kind of that 25-year experience. And the thing that always stuck out to me, and I break it down to a story. So a guy that I played high school basketball with became a police officer, and he was finishing up his PhD in sociology. So we started to talk, and he was like, look, man, I want you to talk to my old commanding officer. And I'm like, oh, shit, here I go on another list, right? So he puts me on I remember I was in State College, Pennsylvania, in a hotel on a three-way call. And he puts me in contact with this former, and in Chicago, they used to call them gang tactical units. Yep. So he found out a little bit about some of the stuff that I do, and he said, Stovall, he said, look, I heard about you, and I think you're absolutely right. He said, but I want to tell you something. He said, I want to tell you how to make a killer. And he said, look, the process is simple. He said, what you do, you don't have a place for them to live. You don't have a viable place for them to go to school. You don't have a viable place for them to receive health care. They do not have living wage employment. And then you hire me to contain them. But more importantly, you hire me to contain them with the hope that they will eliminate themselves in the process. And then he said, look, we know that no Black child born on any place on the planet is inherently prone to violence. He said, but what we do know is that we can create instances where violence is more likely to occur, right? So for me, and I'm listening to this old cop just kind of break this down, and I'm saying to myself, like, man, first thing I said is, how the hell did this dude stay on the force, right? Because he had that very clear structural analysis. But then for me, it was saying, well, I know school space the best. Now, what are schools connected to? Housing, right? Good friend of mine always says, education is a housing issue because housing is an education issue, right? So they're inextricably connected. Then, well, what else is happening in this space when we talk about these conflicts, right? So then this space around how are police used in places where people have the fewest access, the least amount of access to resources in relationship to education and schools. And then we just saw and this is the earlier phase of school closings, we saw this hyper-policing of young people in certain schools, right? So I'll give you all a quick example. There's a school in Chicago called Clemente, named after the baseball player Roberto Clemente, right? And Clemente had a rule because there was a school that was closed on the west side of the city called Austin. And the students from Austin were sent 7 miles across all these different spaces to Clemente when there was a school up the street from them. So when they got to Clemente, they had a rule where school resource officers in the lunchroom could be no less than 30 feet from each other and always in each other's sight. And I'm hearing this and I'm saying to myself, well, I know the other place that happens, right? And I know folks who work in that other place, right? So now when we talk about that relationship, the first thing I said to myself is, well, if they're doing that to young people, what do they think of them? Like who are they? Right? And now in opposed to an asset, why are they now understood as the error? Right? So this was always, so those three things always coalesce with education being first, because it was what are schools connected to? Right? And now if I look at that, I can start to have this very different conversation, one that people know and live, but isn't as discussed as much.
That's really powerful. And I'm just wondering, before we get to questions from the audience, I'm sure there might be some people from Chicago either here, okay, cool,
No doubt.
or watching, following along online. We also have a virtual audience. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about language. There are several places in the book where you kind of stop and say, look, I want to choose my words really carefully here. I'm really careful about not saying gangs. Actually, I'm going to say street organizations, or using the word crime, because it occurs to me that as you're talking, that it's actually when the violence occurs that the violence then becomes part of the rationale for doing more harm to people instead of trying to meet their basic needs. And so there's a way in which in the public mind, it's almost like you're trying to blame people as individuals and then send the police in to, like, quote unquote, catch the bad guys. Can you just talk about some of your language choices in the book and maybe how you came to this language, like how it's crucial to thinking about this as an engineered conflict, not a problem of individuals?
And because I wanted to pay attention, and thank you for that question, but because I wanted to pay attention to how structures move, I wanted to have the language around what we're actually talking about and how we understand their function, right? So back to engineering. So if we, instead of saying, this kind of individualized violence, what does it mean to understand it as structural? Instead of thinking about these kind of unstructured, random groupings of young people roaming around as gangs, if you know anything about those relationships, those are organizations, clearly, right? So now when we started to think about it, and also the language of disposability, right? So not to pull a punch around that, right? You only do these particular things to folks that you feel to be disposable, right? You wouldn't do this to people that you feel to be valuable.
Right. People you cared about.
Exactly. It's like you wouldn't do these things. So I wanted to be very explicit about that language, because that type of definitive language forces us to go into the history of those spaces, right? It pushes us to now think about, well, how did these street organizations come up, right? So when you talk about Black and Latino gangs in Chicago, most were formed to protect themselves from the police, right? So this thing around, so when we have that particular question, now we have to ask something else, right? And in many cases, some of the gangs actually, or street organizations, they coalesced around the understandings of Black power and self-determination, right? And some split because of how they saw Black power and self-determination, right? So these things are always multifaceted. But I thought the language allowed us to get away, because I wanted to get folks away from the headlines, right? Because, in a news clip, they're not going to say disinvestment, structural violence, or late-stage capitalism, right? That's too many syllables for the soundbite, right? So now, to get us into a different conversation, because to your original point, violence has a visceral effect, right? So if someone is affected by violence, it's visceral, right? So now you respond to it in particular ways. And in many instances, you can respond to it in ways that are either displaced or go back to the person who has enacted the violence with even more force, right? So now if you think about an interruption, how do you interrupt that particular dynamic, right? And what have people been doing to interrupt that?
Yeah, fascinating. So you mentioned before that critical race theory is an animating theoretical framework for what you're doing here, but you also have a geographic framework that you're trying to communicate that the Black experience happens in a place, and that the dynamics of space really matter. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to that analysis and how you think about it?
So critical race theory has, and for the people who say that, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, for the people who say that it's not a theory, it's a theory, right? Because people get into that, well, critical race theory isn't a theory, it's a collection. It's a theory, right? And it was started around a critique of something called critical legal studies that said the criminal legal system is a class-based system. Critical race theory said the criminal legal system is a class and race and gendered and ableized system, right? And the piece around critical race, there's divisions of critical race theory. So I come through it through critical race praxis, right? So this action and reflection in the world to change conditions because you understand the racial dynamics of the world. This particular book came by way of critical race praxis and also something called critical race spatial analysis. So this was championed by Danny Solorzano and Veronica Velez, who always says, every space has a racial story. So now, what is the racial story of Chicago? And it brings me back to being here in New York. I remember being in Brooklyn once, and in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there's this garage right off of Garvey that just says, Brooklyn is for Brooklyn. And I remember some days I would just walk by and just like kind of just look at it and just go, man, that's a hellified statement. Because what it was saying that that space was on the edge of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Fort Greene. And that particular space had been deeply affected by gentrification, right? And what they were saying, that Brooklyn is for Brooklyn, for me, put forward, do not forget the people who were here, right? And the people who are still here. And the same thing in Chicago, and critical race theory and critical race spatial analysis has me to say, we cannot forget what this racial story is. And an example that I always think about that. So Chicago has lost 350,000 Black people since 1980, right? And the vast majority of those folks have left since 2000. So now when we put that in context, there are spaces in Chicago that used to be Black epicenters that no longer exist, right? So now, how do we think about that? In my New York equivalent in Brooklyn, again, I go back to Fulton Mall, right? So many of you all may know Fulton Mall to be something completely different, right? I remember it was this music store. I always would mess up the name, and now you're on Fulton Mall. And you look at Atlantic and you say to yourself, oh, this is different. But it used to be something else. And that was a thing around not only remembering, but also when we look at the current moment, that conflict is now telling us that that group who has remained gets further tossed in that area of disposability.
So back to this as as a personal book. So besides your stints in Brooklyn, you write a lot about your experiences growing up, the things you knew growing up, things you didn't know, your personal connections to these organizations, complications of your presence there now in various ways and relations. Can you just talk about how you position yourself in relation to what's happening there now, how you think about your relationship to the city in the past? Just tell us a little bit about how you come into this story.
I have a graduate student who always says to me, he says, there are no innocents because all are indicted, right? And that's just how I have to understand a very complicated relationship with home, right? So it's this space around, a space that I've known, a space that I've existed in, a space that I know very well, but also a space where there's some contradictions there, right? And now, how do I run up on those contradictions, right? So me purchasing a house in a neighborhood two and a half miles north of where I grew up, now has potentially displaced a group of Black elders from their space, right? Because they can no longer afford the property taxes, right? So this thing around really putting that contradiction in real time, in real conversation, right? And understanding, we criminalize people who may have membership or affiliations with street organizations, but those were the people that I played basketball with. Those are the people who I grew up with. Those are the people that I had interactions with who kept me safe in certain instances, right? And this thing around like hearing my parents talk about the neighborhood that I live in now, right? So I had this really interesting conversation with both of my parents, and they named all the clubs and taverns in a 2-block radius, right? And they just kind of walked, and it was in the summer. My father just kind of walked in the street. And he said, "Oh yeah, such and such used to be right here. Oh yeah, that's where Trivoli used to be. Okay, that was the Godfather 3." I mean, he just literally breaks this whole thing down. And I'm like, man, how does it feel that none of those exist? And he said, it's like, man, as you get older, you think about change being evident, but you also think about who is affected by that change, right? And I think that's a question that I have to ask myself as a Chicagoan, right? Who is affected by that change? And more importantly, who is harmed in that process? So I can't run from that. So I have to really sit up in that contradiction and make that claim around, there's no kind of claim to innocence here, in opposed to saying it's deeply complex. We got to ask the questions of white supremacy. We got to ask the questions of late stage capitalism. We got to ask the questions of uneven development and displacement, right? It can't, and I am in that conversation, right? It's nothing that is distant from me, right? And if I'm not careful, I could participate in enacting an engineering of conflict in certain spaces.
Yeah, speaking of, engineering conflict, you mentioned before how school closures can lead to more intensive school policing, but it can also actually lead to more violence out on the streets. So can you tell us a little bit about how that dynamic has played out in Chicago?
I think in Chicago, and like many cities, but Chicago has a very unique relationship to this. Chicago is a hyper-segregated city, right? So we think about segregation in certain spaces. So in Chicago, still to this day, you can cross the street and be in a totally different place. So you think about that, and neighborhood schools would be a reflection of that, right? So a neighborhood school has people from the neighborhood, right? So people who live in proximity to that school. Now, a couple of blocks away might be another school in another neighborhood. Now, people may think, well, what's the problem? They're so close together. But regional segregation changes our relationship with each other, right? So a New York instance, a good friend of mine lived in Harlem, and she lived in the Carver homes. And we walked out the front of her old building, and I said, well, what's the name of the school literally a half a block away? She said, I don't know, because we didn't walk that way. And I was like, right? Ever, right? So she walk out the house and just make that hard left. She was like, yeah, I couldn't even tell you, right? And in Chicago, there are 77 universes of that, right? So you can walk in different spaces and be someplace totally different. So now, if those neighborhood schools, which are these hubs, are closed, and now people shift into those other spaces, so now walking to that new school could put you in proximity to conflict, right? To the point where Chicago hired a former Army colonel who was responsible for hostage negotiation, right? This dude, Tom Terrell, his expertise was hostage negotiation, that he actually worked in Bosnia. And he created these pathways in Bosnia, Herzegovina, to make sure that folks got to whatever was deemed a safe haven. He comes to Chicago and he creates a program called Safe Passage. Safe Passage is based on hostage negotiation routes to make sure that folks got to safe spaces. So on the first day of safe passage, you had fire trucks in front of schools with armed tactical teams on top of the fire trucks. So I'm saying to myself, well, what young person thinks that's safe? Right? I mean, you walk into school, it's a fire truck with a bunch of armed soldiers on it, essentially, and you say to yourself, okay, this is what they think of our space, but that conflict becomes elevated because of those relationships, right? So I always put folks, in order to understand conflict in Chicago and most cities, we must understand segregation and how segregation functions in terms of people who are actually going through the same things may see each other completely different because of the region in which they live.
And if I could just follow up on that, central to your narrative is this idea that the leadership of the city of Chicago is so committed to a kind of punitive neoliberalism, right? Cutbacks followed by policing and social control. So that rather than imagining safe passages run by community-based organizations, violence interrupters, credible messengers, cure violence, the first thing they think is put cops on top of fire trucks, make a big show of force, intimidate young people. And this just seems so central to your argument.
Right. I mean, and there's this thing around, if we just think about it, just not just in the extreme sense, but just think about being in a lunchroom, right? I always crack this joke with my students, right? I was in a lunchroom and I got school resource officers every 30 feet who, by the way, are off-duty police officers, right? So I got these people every 30 feet, and they got me in the silent lunch. I always crack this joke with my students, like, how many of y'all been in the silent lunch, right? And I'm just like, if you want to understand torture, put young people in a silent lunch, right? So for me, I'm like, well, look, if they already got us in here like we already are on the inside, I'm going to show you what it means to be in this space. Right? If you're going to house and case me like this, man, I'm going as hard as humanly possible until you do something else. Now, that thing, people will say, well, that's just a wayward. Stovall is wayward, right? He's just not engaged. And it's like, man, after that type of treatment continually, right? Because I think it's important to talk about what does it mean to be treated in that way perpetually. You get what people often refer to as this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if you are treating people this way, then a certain behavior will emerge from treating people this way, right? So, I mean, I think that really becomes important because psychologists talk about it all the time, right? We can condition the mind to do quite a few things. And that subtle bit of mind and body control, after a while, if you're not conscious of it, can overtake you.
My 14-year-old, who's highly privileged, would have detention every day if subjected to that.
I mean, like, and people, and when folks are looking at people, they're saying, well, what's the problem? I'm like, people, you can't create the exact same conditions of a prison in a school and then expect young people to engage in some type of educative process. It's just nonsensical.
Yeah. We're almost getting to time for questions from the audience, so be thinking about what you want to ask. And I just want to acknowledge that, I think we've been true to the book so far. It's a hard-hitting book that is trying to go deep and make this analysis of the roots of violence in Chicago. But there's another side to the book, I want to say, which is where you end, which is turning it around and thinking about the question of what is to be done about this? How do you do something about this? And you actually take us through examples of organizations that you point to that are trying to change things and create a different path and try to find a different way. Can you just talk about some of those organizations that seem promising to you? What are the kinds of things that they're doing against, even with all of this engineered conflict and everything arrayed against them?
And thank you for asking that question, because the idea wasn't to write the book and just to have everybody read it and go further into your depression, right? That was not the purpose, right? But what it was to say was that there are people who say this is unacceptable and we will do something else, right? So when we talk about, like, a lot of times I crack jokes with my students all the time and say, you know, abolition is having its sexy moment, right? So everybody talks about it in particular ways. But let's think about abolition in terms of what it means in its core values, right? Something that exists is unacceptable, and it can no longer exist in that way. There's a responsibility to do something else. So there is an organization in Chicago called Ujima Medics, and Ujima is Kiswahili for collective work and responsibility. And the question that they ask, and many of these three organizations that I look at and know the people who are in them, they ask very practical questions. So Ujima Medics was started by at that time, who was a community organizer who became a registered nurse, who was working with a young person who was killed because ambulatory services didn't come quick enough. And she said, well, let's ask this question in the community. What do we do when the ambulance doesn't come? So she got a group of healthcare workers, another set of organizers, a firefighter, to actually develop these trainings for community folks around stabilizing people who had gunshot wounds. So she's literally teaching folks in community space on how to stabilize someone if they've been shot and how to transport them. So those questions now became, well, what else do people need, right? So now it became about diabetes screening. Chicago has one of the highest rates of asthma in the world. How do we get people abreast to asthma and how to take care of it? Healthy eating. So it was from this point, all these other things emanated. Another organization, Equity and Transformation, said, we need to stop talking about street economies and just to understand them as economies, right? The distribution of goods and services because people need them. So now, what does it mean to get folks what they need? And now, if we look at people who have real life hustles, now how do we support that hustle in a way that can also be distributed across broader swaths of the community, right? And then, and so this is everybody, right? So in the old days, for you all here in New York, the old days of Harlem, right? And 125, where you had folks selling books, selling oil, selling incense, right? So all of those spaces now saying, well, can we make space for more people either to participate in that, support it, or move up and do different work? And in the third organization, the Let Us Breathe Collective, they started off, so when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, they went down to Ferguson, Missouri, and a text from Palestinian youth came to the folks in Ferguson, and it said, you all have been surrounded, something is about to happen, you all are about to be tear gassed. Here is what you need to do, right? So it was instruction from Palestinian youth on how to engage tear gas. So they said, all right, if we're gonna go down to Ferguson, the first thing we're taking is gas masks. So they collected, they went to all of the elders, went to all these spaces, got a bunch of gas masks and drove them down to Ferguson. But then these were organizers, but they were also artists. So they said to themselves, all right, how can we do this in Chicago? What do people need? Where do we bring public awareness? And one of the places where they brought public awareness was a place called Homan Square, which was a Chicago Police Department black ops site that had operated for 40 years, right? And the only way we got word now, as a Chicagoan, Homan Square was a folktale. All it was, look, you do not want to get caught up out west, because if you get caught up out west, you could be sent to this one spot where you could be tortured, right? We knew that as young people.
This is the John Burge.
Yeah, so we knew that as little ones, right? You do not want to get caught up out west. And they did another thing called the Jump Out Boys, which actually on the East Coast, you all got a different name for it. But the military calls it extreme rendition. Well, what happens is they'll take a group of young folks that they suspect to be in a street organization, put them in the back of a police car, beat them up, and then drop them off in the opposing set's neighborhood. So they knew this, and so they did a public art campaign right across the street from this Black Ops site to bring awareness to Homan Square, right? And they renamed it Freedom Square. And I remember I was in a concert once, and it was this space in the back, and it had all these clothes, and it was this tall brother, and I said, "Man, who are y'all? What do y'all do?" He was like, "Yeah, man, we are the Let Us Breathe Collective." And he said, "This is a free store." I was like, damn. He was like, "Yeah, man, because we know people, may be unhoused. They may not have access to clothes. So here's some clothes." He was like, "Take what you need, brother, but take what you need." Right? That was his line. And what that emerged into was a space for communal dinners. So this was all, and again, all donated from folks, right? So really asking this question as artists and organizers, we have what we need, but do we have the mechanisms by which to distribute it to other people who need it, right? So this kind of asking these very straightforward questions that now allow us, and I would believe, to rethink possibility in this current moment, right? When so many things look so dire. Right, so now saying, so what can we possibly do and actually do in real time? So really wanting to end on that, because to say that things aren't happening in Chicago on the positive side is just incorrect and irresponsible. So it's really around saying, okay, well, what are people doing and how are they doing it?
So you've got this progressive black mayor in Chicago. Does he get it? And what is he trying to do to reduce this engineered conflict?
Yeah, I think, well, for people who might be unfamiliar, Brandon Johnson is recently elected 2023, and he comes from the rank and file of teacher organizing, and he was a classroom teacher, right? So he taught 7th and 8th grade. He became an organizer for Chicago Teachers Union, and he, in his ascendancy to mayor, because he was a county council person also, and he gets it, right? And so many of you all have been seeing, like, he's really been standing strong on immigration. Like, he was ready. I thought he was ready to go knuckle up with ICE. Like, he was ready, right? Like that. And I think
Bavino cage match.
Yeah, exactly, man. He was ready. He was like, look, whatever it is, Bavino, we got you, right? So he showed his heft in that way. And I think he does understand it. I think there's some structural blockers in him actually adjudicating that vision, right? So he knows that we need mental health care systems, a robust mental health care system. He knows that we need supported schools. He knows that we need access to living wage employment. The thing is, in a city that has been struggling with budget for 40 years, those are challenging tasks. But to your question, he does get it. And he has been in conversation with folks on how to move that. And one thing that he's put forward and is continuing is the living wage experiment, where families are given a certain amount of money for a year, and then after that year, they record what folks did to now say, here's what's possible. And it's modeled after the Stanford guaranteed income experiment that took place in Stockton, California, where 500 families were given $1,000 a month for a year. And then after that year,
no strings.
Right, no strings, right? You enrolled in the program, you get it. And economists couldn't figure this out. Economists couldn't figure out that 93% of the families, the first thing they did was pay bills. Even more, I think 94, 95% of families after paying bills, went out and looked for work. So this thing around, people who just want to be on the rolls, that's a false narrative, right? It's really around the things, the processes that we have available to folks to access to get what they need. And back to equity, because they need it, right? In opposed to just kind of something that's just kind of flatly distributed.
All right, let's hear from the audience. What are you wondering as you listen to this conversation? And we have a microphone, I think, going around. There it is, yeah. So raise your hand, please. In the front.
Hi, my name is Anthony Albergati. I'm a student of the court for the state of New Jersey. Wow, you said a lot of stuff. Welcome. I'm just wondering, in your book, is there a conflict/resolution? And it sounds like toward the end of the book there is, even though I haven't checked out the book yet. But yeah, I got from you what my mother was trying to tell me as a retiree of NYPD, that I'm treated different. I didn't understand what she was talking about. She mentioned, in case you got into trouble, and now I think I get some of that. I'm different, so I'm not as harassed or abused public. I didn't think I was traumatized by NYPD ever because I wasn't arrested a lot, but I had to speak before City Hall about that too. They had a special unit that was specifically 2020, and I watched them, and I thought, they're going to war because they were in riot gear, full riot gear. I'd never seen that before. I didn't think I was traumatized. Of course I was. Just seeing that, and I walked away thinking, oh, that's just them, not me. But for 6 hours, we all spoke about the abuses, the physical abuses. I mean, there was lawyers, there were public people speaking about being present at protests. But when they talked about these specific officers, their careers of violence was incredible. They specifically got officers who had a history of that to work, and NYPD had one of the worst reactions I've ever seen. I mean, they sat there with their arms folded. They didn't want to hear what we had to say. They were on the screen, and it was suggested that they be subpoenaed next time to come and really listen because they weren't getting it. That the public was pissed off, and we could respond. We have some power. So again, I'm curious about your resolution talk.
And maybe something about the role of trauma in all of this and structural violence.
Right. And this thing around trauma having these long-term effects, but long-term unresolved effects. And I think when we put that in the broader conversation, we can start to think about, I think as a baseline in terms of resolution, you will not arrest your way out of conflict. You will not arrest your way out of violence. What you do is deepen the role of people who are now ensnared in the criminal legal system. Now, there's a split in that, right? Because some people will argue, well, maybe that's the point. Well, others will say, well, look, if you actually put time in spaces to develop relationships, there's the greater chance that folks will not engage in conflict. And I bring this back to what people talk about in brain science all the time. Neurologists always talk about this. The neurologists always talk about when the body releases cortisol, right? That's our fight, flight, freeze mechanism. If the body does not release that cortisol, then it backs up in our system, right? And those years of backup now create all these deleterious health effects, right? Whether it be hypertension, whether it be certain forms of cancer, whether it be hypervigilance, right? So all of these things we know, right? And this is always, I have a mentor named Phil Bowman, and he always says, like, look, Stovall, we know exactly what to do, but is there the political will to do it, right? But I think that first thing, we will not arrest our way out of this. And containing people does not get us to address the issue. What we do see over time is that building relationships, and while building relationships, having strategies and practices where people can maintain themselves actually reduces violence. So when we talk about the three things that reduce violence, we never have this conversation, right? We know that reducing violence includes having access to quality education, access to health care, and access to housing. We know those three things. We got 80 years of criminological data that show us that those three things reduce violence, right? And now the piece becomes, where are the instances where we lift up where that's happening and really get to understand what's going on? And I'll end with this point. I remember a group of indigenous community workers came to Chicago, and this is when the homicide rate had kind of spiked. And one of the folks from the delegation said, I wonder who those young people are in relationship with. And for me, it just popped. And she said, well, who are they in relationship with? And she said, not necessarily as a solution, but as an understanding. Because if you understand who people are in relationship with, then you understand the conflict differently, right? And now, if you understand the conflict differently, now you can have a different conversation that gives you more the opportunity to reduce that conflict, right? And I think as a structural issue, we now need to think about those things that reduce violence outside of any carceral relationship, which we know does not work.
I think I got it now. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking while you're thinking about when I was growing up in New York City, how coming from school, like our school's not really like campus like, but it's like we spill out into the street, and over time, the stores are not welcoming to us. It's like you are constricted, and you passing other schools, and it's like, A train line was basically, it was like, man, from school to school is like another group coming in. It's like conflict. So the A line was just like from the Bronx all the way to Queens. Was, man, it was a horrible ride going home. And the fact that we just spilled out in the street, so to have 1,000+ kids coming out, and it's like nowhere to funnel through. This is kind of before they started really thinking about after-school programs. But even though with after-school programs, it's like the facilities are still some journey to get through. There's nothing in the vicinity of schools. So you got whether it be YMCA or PAL and all that stuff. It's still a journey to get through. And if you have all these businesses making sure kids are just shuttered and don't come into their stores, there's like, why these structures don't have any open spaces or programs to let them in. But also in the same time when we were going to high school, there was other schools that was like more private schools, and you go past them and like you realize like they block off the block so that we couldn't even go past it. And like they somehow, like now you see with some schools over here where they'll basically block off the street where traffic can't go through. But I saw it back then, but I guess the privileged schools were able to have that the way they block off the street so that make sure that we as high schoolers wouldn't travel down their block to basically keep their kids safe. So I was like, things like that was what I witnessed growing up.
Yeah, you made me think about, I was here in early December, and November, and there's a school that two of my homies used to teach at called Brooklyn Friends. Right, so literally right at the bridge, essentially, J Street Metro Tech stop on the AC, and it was young folks playing soccer in the little lot. I was like, man, they cut off the street for them, right? I just thought about it, just kind of a thing. They cut off the street for them. Now there's a neighborhood public high school 2 blocks away, right? And now they had what happens to them is that kind of funneling, right? They funnel all of them into the area that the old downtown Brooklyn, close to the promenade or what have you. But this thing around how, and this is, thank you for making this point, because this is something that we see across the country, right? So in Los Angeles, there are these two huge high schools in the Rampart. That's a district right outside of downtown LA. And when they let out, I mean, it looks like a concert, right? And you're just saying to yourself, that's every day. So what do, right? They don't have places for young folks to go to, so they all corral them, right? They put up riot horses, right? So literally they got the riot horses and then they funnel them into these spaces. All the streets are one way, going the same way, so you can't kind of weave your way through. So you all have to go through this one spot. I'm saying to myself, and police departments will refer to it as population control, right? So this thing around really thinking about how that operates. And after you experience that after a while, back to the earlier question, those cortisol levels start to go up, right? And then you start, and again, it's a proximity question, right? Because you can't air out the frustration that you have at the system. So now you air it out on the people that you are proximal to, right? And people know this, right? They know this very clearly. But I think it's really important to kind of put that things that we think to be innocuous have deleterious long-term effects, right? And we have to have that conversation if we're serious about addressing those issues.
Okay.
Hello. Hi.
Hey, what's happening?
I am Tony. I am a second-year doctoral student at the Graduate Center. Shout out Professors Vitale and Jones. You answered some of my questions that I was noting down while you were talking, and my fellow classmate here. We were wondering a few things as it pertains to the city here in New York and our disciplinary practices and stuff like that. But we did a lot of talking about what we can do from the outside, and we did a lot of talking and listening to the programs that are happening, like the grassroots organizations that are doing the work outside of the schools. But as both a product of New York City Public School and a parent now of New York City Public Schools, who has now been walking the same basic 25-year journey. Like once I became a parent, I became even more invested in the treatment that I received growing up. You argue that conflict is often produced to justify control. How do you see suspension and exclusionary discipline in New York City schools functioning as outcomes of engineered conflict rather than responses to student behavior? Like even from the onset, like in New York City schools, we have OSIS numbers rather than ID numbers that are like identifiers that are similar to an inmate number, because when a student goes to prison, when someone goes to prison here in New York State and they go to this prison, they have that number, and that number forever follows them. When you look them up in any system, that number forever follows them. But when we register our children from the onset, they get this identification number, this OSIS number, that's like their inmate number. It follows them to every school regardless. So you think, oh, well, my kid's gonna get a new start if I change them. But the minute you pull them up in that system, that record is there. There's no such thing as a ceiling, so to speak. So that was the first question, and then
I don't know if we have time for several because
it's not several. This is
okay,
like
because
it
we're at the
intertwines-
end time already. So
it intertwines with it. Is we wonder how this breaks down across grade levels. Does it look different for elementary schools versus middle school or high school, because it follows them from the onset being engineered?
So you have two, and thank you, Tony, for that question. Good to see you. You have we have a number of oscillating levels that we have to contend with. One, usually, as the younger the young person is, the lesser the infractions. But we see this kind of tipping point depending on the race and ethnicity of the young person by third grade, right? And you all in New York have it a little different, because you all do your first testing in second grade. So that So once we see that second grade grouping get a little older, this is when we start to see the infractions, right? Now, for Black and Latina youth, it starts younger, of course, but we start to see them grow once you get past that first threshold in second grade. Now it grows. Here in New York City, there is a new dynamic that Monique Morris puts into the ether that we haven't actually seen. Maybe started about 10, 15 years ago, where Black girls are outpacing Black boys in disciplinary infractions, right? And this is, so a group of young people called Girls for Gender Equity actually started doing that work. So that's GGE's work where they started to lay this out. So now, when we start to see that, and instead of outcomes, this can actually, a school can be rewarded for this, right? So so they can say, you're doing a good job. You're getting rid of all the bad ones, right? So now, especially if those suspension rates are now starting to see improvements in grades and test scores, right? But what we do know, they're not correlated, right? So what it is saying, we just wanted to get rid of them so we can do this other work, in opposed to saying, if I paid attention to the young folks who are first expressing their boredom, we could do something different.
Or whatever other crisis they have in their lives.
Exactly. So now it's really around thinking about, again, the relationship. And do we have a mechanism to assess the relationship that we have with our young folks and families, right? But I think when you start to look at those numbers, and New York has been, so now with the GGE study, you're starting to see this across the country, right? Where Black girls are starting to outpace Black boys, which were always thought of as the issue or concern. So I think this really becomes important because that can be used as a badge to now pump more resources into a school dependent on who you've gotten rid of, right? So I think and back to the conflict, right? Because now, if that happens to a young person as a fifth grader, where do you start to put them, right? And now you got a whole school of those fifth graders who have been excluded, right? And in Chicago, there's a really interesting documentary. Now, on this point, there's a really interesting documentary called Last Chance High. I have no idea why they called it Last Chance High because it's not about a high school. It's about a grade school called Montefiore. And Vice Television did it. And Montefiore has since closed, but Montefiore was everybody, all the young people in the city who had some engagement with the criminal legal system and had been granted release. So Montefiore was where they put you. And they talked about literally how it had been drained of resources and what happened to those young folks, because it actually records Montefiore's closure. So it gives you a sense of what happens, and it's a really interesting conversation around trauma. It's a really interesting conversation around relationships, and then a group that comes out of that called Boxing Out Negativity really started to get some important visibility because the director was from the neighborhood, went to Montefiore, and said, there has to be a way to interrupt this. So it's a really good piece, ironically from Vice Television, but one that's really worthwhile, and now it's posted up on YouTube now for free.
Please join me in welcoming and thanking Dave Stovall and Alex Vitale. Thank you to all of my library colleagues for hosting.
Please support public libraries.